Hey everybody, welcome to this video where we are diving into this specific visual down here in the bottom of the scorecard dashboard. And we're going to dive into a couple tricks that you can use to really spice up these trend lines. If I give this visual as part of my dashboard to my end users, I could easily run into scenarios where someone says, instead of having 120 days in this trend line, which we can see is the case right now, could I see this for 60 days? And if you anticipate that need, or you expect that to be something that would be valuable to your end users, then you can use this concept of parameters to really bring it to life in an intuitive way. Your user can control the parameter. This little box I'm clicking on here, that's actually a parameter, and the user can control it in the dashboard, but then also that parameter is communicating with calculated fields in the back end of my workbook in the data source to really make this come to life. The same thing actually goes for the moving average. And I added this in here as well because we are talking about price movements. And so it could easily be the case that someone is concerned with seeing what's the overall trend in this price movement. So maybe the daily movements are just wild and all over the place, and it's a little bit hard, a little bit difficult to see what's the overall trend. Well, that's where this moving average could really come in and help paint a smoother picture. And in general, the more days that you include in a moving average, the more smoothed out that trend line is going to become, and it's not going to care as much about the short-term price movements because it's considering more data points in that entire average for any given point. So what a 20-day moving average means in this case, specifically here with Tableau, it means that we are considering our current day's value, but then we're also looking back at the 19 days that led up to our current day's value, and we're going to average all of those values together. So if my price drops today, but it's been fairly high for the last 19 days before today, then my moving average is not going to be impacted as much as my actual price will be on the trend line, because the moving average would need to have a lot more price movements across multiple days in order for it to be impacted. All right, so now that we've gone through the ins and outs of moving averages and all that stuff, let's dive into how you actually bring this to life. So I'm inside our development workbook where we don't have the final product yet. And if this is new to you, definitely go check out the previous videos, because this is part 5 in building this scorecard dashboard from concept to completion. So let's pick up where we left off in those previous videos, and let's just consider what's the first thing we need to do here. And I would argue, let's go ahead and just try to build this up as much as we can without having these parameters. So what this is going to look like is, we know we need time in the picture. So let's go ahead and bring our time dimension, wherever that's hiding, up here under dates original base. Let's just bring time into the picture, and I'm going to drop it into columns because I want to get this this x-axis of time, just like we see here. Our price is moving from left to right over time, so that means we want our date in columns, and then we want some kind of measure, in this case our closing price, and we can drag this up here to rows. And in the dashboard, we're only looking at a single cryptocurrency price at a time. So let's go ahead and filter to just a single cryptocurrency price pair. And we can do that using this, this symbol aliased uppercase field, which, just as a little refresher, is simply taking the uppercase version of whatever our crypto symbols are. And let's make sure that we only look at one of these. So I'm going to go with our favorite here, Bitcoin USD. And now we can see all-time history for this. And Sure, you could filter on time base over here, and we could make a relative date filter and expose that to the user. But in this case, let's flex these muscles on how you can make a parameter interact with the calculated field. And then we'll reapply some of what we see there in order to control how many days are factored into a moving average. But before we can have a parameter interacting with a calculated field, we kind of have to walk through these steps of basic ingredients that we need. And in this case, we're talking parameters, we're talking calculated fields. Well, I don't have any parameters yet. So what I'm going to do is down here where if you have any of this extra space, white space at the bottom of your data pane, this is what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on that white space, not on measure values, but just below measure values. And I'm going to say, let's create a parameter. And once I do create a parameter, we're going to have some real estate here in our data pane that's specifically dedicated to parameters. But we need to first decide, what is this parameter going to be called? So if this parameter is a control for us in order to control how many days are in the trend line, then maybe a name like param and then days in trend line makes sense. Now we get to decide what kind of data type we want this to be, and you could go with a floating point number, which means it has decimals, so like 11.4, 12.39, but I'm going to go with integer because I want to limit these inputs to just be whole numbers. So how many days do you want in the trend line? Well, you could say 10, you could say 15, but you're not going to say 17.3 because the granularity of our data here is just at the daily level anyway. So there is no concept of a third of a day or something like that. So let's set this to an integer, and maybe by default we want to show 90 days. Seems reasonable to me, and that's what this current value is. So with the value when the workbook opens, it's just going to be 90. All right, I'm happy with this. So let's click OK. And now we can see down here, we have this section for parameters. Now me always liking to be organized in my data pane. If you did have multiple parameters and different varieties of what parameters are doing, sometimes it's nice to group these by folders, just like we do for our calculated fields. So I'm going to call this params and then /control. So anything that I'm using as kind of controlling my visuals, perhaps as inputs my users interact with to control the visuals, I'm going to end up putting into this folder. So we have the number of days in the trend line, and while we're here, let's just go ahead and create another parameter, and I'm going to call this one, this is for my moving average, so let's call this param, and then days in moving average. Whoops, I didn't define all the details for this. So let's go ahead and make this one an integer as well. So just whole numbers. And then let's default this to something like 5. So I'm going to just plop that into that same folder for params control. But now the kind of stage of evolution here that we need in order to have a parameter impacting our visual is step 1, you need to create a parameter. Step 2, you need to have a calculated field that's doing some kind of logic. And then step 3 is you need to have the parameter playing a role in that logic of the calculated field. And then finally, step 4 is using that calculated field somewhere in your worksheets or in your dashboard. So we have the parameter, but right now we don't have a calculated field that's referencing that parameter. So there's no way that that parameter right now is interacting with and impacting our visuals. So let's go ahead and create another filter in here for the filters / time periods / current, because I want, as part of my filters here, I want this filter that I can drag into my filters box that's going to tell me if any given day is within 90 days of my most recent day. So that's really what this thing is doing out here, right? When I say 120 days in the trend line, it's saying, all right, here's your maximum day, here's your highest date value, and then we're only going to allow in days that fall within 120 days behind that maximum day. So the way that this can be translated into logic is, well, first let's give this thing a decent name. So just following the style of these other date filters we already have, I'm going to call this filter, and then it's a Boolean filter. It's going to spit out either true or false. That's just the simplest way for us to determine, for any given day, if we line them all up, should you be in this worksheet, true or false? And then we're only going to let in the values that have that true stamp on them. So now I'm going to give this some kind of name. Out here we can see I was following this pattern of it saying, like, what are we filtering? Well, is this the current day? Is it the current month? In this case, we're going to say is within trendline. So now we can come up with the logic here. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to say, let's do a date diff. So a date diff function, you could read about it over here. And what this is really doing is it's saying, all right, give me a date part. That's either day, week, month, quarter, year. Then what we're going to do is if you give me two different dates, we can calculate the number of periods that exist between those two dates. So I'm going to pass in here day as my date part. And then my start date, that's the earlier of the two dates. That's going to be whatever date is showing up in the data for any given period here. So like as I'm hovering over different dates in this line, we can see, okay, June 6th, June 28th, 2020. And then what I want is for any of these dates, I want this to compare against the end date, which is in my case something that we stored up here. In Anchor, we always have access to what that maximum date is that's coming through in our data. So let's just build this. Let's say take the time base and compare that to the time max. And then if the difference between those 2 days, so if this difference is less than the number of days that I have defined in this parameter for days in trendline, then this should evaluate to true. Otherwise, it's going to be false. So if you're let's say, let's see what the actual value in here is right now. So this is 90. So if this date represented here is actually 91 days away from this date, then this is not going to evaluate to true. It's going to be false. Same thing if it's 100 days. This date difference, then this is going to evaluate to false. But if this is 30, if it's 45, this is going to evaluate to true. So let's just test this. Click OK. Drop this into filters. And now is where we decide, okay, which values are we including or excluding? In this case, I only want to include values that are true, where the number of days between my maximum date and whatever date I'm looking at is within 90. All right, so we have ourselves now a parameter that's interacting with a calculated field, and it is producing this, this filter logic for us that we can then integrate into our worksheet, and it's going to impact what we're seeing. All right, beautiful. Now we need to add in this ability to see two lines at the same time. So the way we're going to do this is we can just find our closing price, and we could drag this over here into rows next to our existing closing price. So you now have the same field showing up twice, so we get the exact same chart just stacked on top of one another. And what we can do is we could say, all right, I want to make this either a dual axis chart, or maybe you want to just make this a combined axis chart. Problem is you can't make a combo axis with the same field. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this dual axis chart that we have here. But first, I'm going to convert this into not just looking at our close price, but giving us a table calculation. So I can come down here, a quick table calculation. I can give us a moving average. And now these two aren't the exact same. So if I wanted to, I could make a combo axis, or you could make a dual axis chart by right-clicking on this pill and saying, give me a dual axis. The difference here is that a dual axis does not necessarily synchronize the numbers. If you have a combined axis, then you only have one number scale, but a dual axis chart would allow you to show two different number scales while still overlaying the trends on top of one another. So in this case, it really doesn't matter which one you go with. But since I prefer dual axis just because it gives me the ability to, it gives me more flexibility in general. And if you do go with a dual axis, you're going to want to make sure that you synchronize your axes. So that means that 55 over here lines up exactly with 55 over here. And if we really do have the same axis scale on both sides, then there's no reason for us to keep showing this one. So if we right click on this, we could also say, let's uncheck show header. And now under the marks card area, you'll notice that you can control individual marks card components for either of these axes, even though we have hidden the axis for our moving average over here. It still is, a different line chart. So we could control things like the color. So first, let's control the overall size for all of our marks cards represented here. So for both the actual closing price and the moving average, let's just make these a little bit less thick. And let's also go into our actual closing price, and we could edit the color here. We could actually, if we want to, we could get rid of the measure names. I'm going to do that. I don't really care about measure names in this case because we do have these individual axes, and we could just change the color for each one of these marks cards. So for my actual price, I'm going to have a black line, and then for my moving average, I'm going to have a gray line. So now we have two different lines. We're seeing our actual price and we're seeing the 5-day moving average. But how could we actually do this effect where as you change the number in a parameter, you're actually changing the number of days that are computed in your moving average? So how do we make that happen? Well, what we're going to do is first just realize that you could double click into this pill up here, which is giving us the table calculation for that moving average. And we can see that this is referencing a number for how it determines how many days are included in the moving average. So instead of using this hard-coded number, we could just make this point to param days in moving average. And what this is going to do for us is now, if we show this value, you can interact with this, and it's changing the number that this table calculation is referencing. So one thing I do want to point out is this 0 over here is telling you that that's the way that the table calculation works. This is the end of the data points it considers. So 0 is actually for any given date. That date is at index 0, and then it's going to look back however many values we have in this parameter. So one thing I do want to point out is the way that this is working is if in our parameter we have 10, you're actually going to have 11 days in your moving average because the day that you're currently on is considered as one of those data points. So if you truly want to see 10 days in your moving average, we need to take that into consideration and just add 1 to this negative value. So this is saying we're looking back 10 days, but now that we're adding a 1 to this, keep in mind that this value here is negative because it has a negative sign in front of it. So if we add 1 to it, it's almost as if we're saying I only want to see 9 days in the moving average. But because we consider that current day in that calculation as well, this actually ends up giving us what we've plugged into the parameter, which is the 10 days in that moving average. If that's confusing to you, just feel free to skip over that thought. It's not really that big of a deal. There are other ways that you could handle this. You could also change where the index ends. But in any case, the core concept here we want to really focus on is that by double clicking into this calculated field, as it's defined here in this pill, we are able to, instead of hard coding a single value, we are able to point to a parameter value, and now that moving average is dynamically changing as we define different values here. All right, so one last thing I want to touch on here is the formatting for the sheet. Right now we have this kind of really kind of hideous formatting. Let's start with the axis. Maybe for the axis itself, we might just want to say, this is a dollar symbol. So we're seeing US dollars over here. We might even, let's just put a closing the closing price. And then we could say US dollars. And we'll come back, we'll revisit this in another video in case we want to change this formatting a bit. But then let's also get rid of all these lines. So something that I'm a big fan of is that concept of don't have anything in your dashboard that you don't need there, and that includes lines. So some people love to throw as many axis tick marks and grid lines and row lines as possible. I am not one of those people, so I'm going to right click on the background here, format it, and let's go into borders and just get rid of everything. All of these lines that we see, I don't want any of them. And then make sure that for rows and columns, it's the same story. Just don't want all that extra stuff. So now we can see this is already starting to look a little bit better, but I still get these horizontal lines. And some people like these because you can just easily scan across and see, is this over here actually the same as this over here? But I'm just going to stick with my principles over here, and I'm going to get rid of my axis tick marks and my axis rulers and grid lines and zero lines. The only ones I'm going to leave in the picture are reference lines and trend lines, just in case, if you added a trend line or if you added a reference line, you probably want to see that. So drop lines I'm going to get rid of as well. So anyways, now we end up in this scenario where we have a more clean chart, much more looking like this, where you don't have axis tick marks, you don't have grid lines, you don't have really all that filler ink that's taking up space in your dashboard. So the only things we are seeing are things that matter, the data itself. All right, so that's where I want to really leave off today. I'm actually also going to not show the individual dates down at the bottom, and maybe give this thing a title. So we could call this closing price daily, well, let's say average closing price trend line day. All right, so now we've built that up much in the same fashion as what we have in our final product. So that's going to be it for the video today. And then in the follow-up video, next week, we're really going to start to dive into how do we bring this dashboard to life in terms of the layout. So as I hover over all these different areas of the dashboard, we can notice that, okay, this rectangle over here is in line with this rectangle over here. There are also some various layout containers at play in this dashboard. So I'm going to just start to cover a lot of these, like when I'm building a dashboard, how do I go about thinking about layout containers? And if I know that I'm going to have this pattern, for example, of content where I want the same amount of real estate here for this item as I want for this one, how can you make your life easier with layout containers and such? So I'll hopefully see you in that video as well, and I hope you got something out of this one today. And until next time, hope you enjoyed this video.